Okay, everyone, welcome to the TBR webinar series, and today we're going to be discussing edge computing in the context of digital transformation and IT services and cloud and emerging technologies. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box. We will address them at the end of the webinar. We typically wrap up the presentation itself after about 40 minutes to leave plenty of time for Q&A. And one frequent question is, can I get a copy of the slides? So after the webinar, you will receive an email with a replay link, as well as a link to view and register other TBR webinars, and you can respond to that email, or you can reach out to us directly and request a copy of the slides. You'll get our email addresses at the end of the presentation. So coming to you today really from three different perspectives. So my colleague Nicki looks at cloud and software, the cloud and software world, and she's done pretty extensive research on the business of edge compute for cloud and software vendors. Hristov leads our digital transformation practice and looks at edge within the context of digital transformation engagements, particularly from the perspective of IT services vendors and the strategy and operations consultants. And I'm sort of trying to be the bridge between those worlds, which is another way of saying I have the luxury of taking the 10,000-foot view while Nicki and Boz get into the specifics around the vendors and their business models. And if you're new to TBR and you're wondering why I keep saying vendors, that's because that is how we look at the world that we cover. We try to understand individual vendor strategy and performance and then place them into the context of the market that they play in. So welcome to this webinar, and here's what we're going to cover today. We want to start with evolution and adoption and put some perspective on what we're talking about when we talk about edge. Then we're going to dive into some use cases and some use cases specific to the pandemic. And then next we'll get into the players in the ecosystem, first from that broader view and then very vendor specific. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Nicki.
Thank you, Patrick. I will start by acknowledging, which I guess would be the big purple box in the room, of what is edge computing. As we all know, edge computing can mean slightly different or maybe vastly different things to different people. I created this definition today, as I go through the evolution, just to refer to some of the points around edge, particularly around machine learning, how it's evolving, that are the most salient to the themes that we'll be talking about today. But with that said, as a precursor to the current trends driving the adoption of edge computing, we thought it would be helpful to take a step back for a brief reminder of the various, generations, if you will, of centralized and distributed computing that have led up to where we are with edge today. Over time, the constraints of centralized computing have definitely motivated the creation of a distributed computing architecture, and then vice versa. So you ended up seeing, for lack of a better term, this pendulum-type swing. And that being said, though, it's not like the evolution ever really eradicated any of the technologies that came before. For instance, we're not saying that the edge is replacing the cloud by any stretch, but it's certainly coming into its own, especially in terms of its role in amplifying the value of hybrid cloud, and has been intensely influenced by the accessibility of emerging technologies, especially AI and machine learning. It's also important to note that a couple of the constants have always been in place as this pendulum continues to swing. One is the learning curve. It's always leading to improvement upon the missteps from the previous swing or generation. And then number two, scale always continues to grow, and by orders of magnitude. And we're definitely seeing that come into play here with edge. And the question mark at the end has a couple of different functions. At the highest level, it's a reflection that, of course, statement of the obvious, we're living in an era of total uncertainty in some ways. It's also a reflection around how IT roadmaps that may have spanned 5 to 7 years, a little over a year ago, are now incredibly truncated, stopping at most 3 years, but usually sit around 1 or 2 years. Because in an uncertain world that's advancing so quickly in terms of technology and outside forces beyond our control, the future is incredibly hard to plan for. And without some guidance, people are literally planning in the dark. Question mark is also about how the uncertainties are going to drive the future of opportunities for many IT consulting firms to help their clients. So just as the advent of cloud produced a whole host of new opportunities for IT services vendors to advise on anything from the architecture to migration to strategy and deployment, The explosion of edge computing has created a whole bunch of similar opportunities, but to many degrees of greater magnitude, just due to the massive and growing scale and distribution of this technology. So with that, Patrick, I think you were going to move to our first polling question.
Yeah, let's do a polling question. So, what are the most pressing concerns that your clients have around adoption of edge technologies? Is security and accessibility, control and complete complexity of management, cost, time to scale, lack of proven use cases, or other priorities? And I will say this is about a year from the last time that we did a joint cross-practice webinar at TBR, bringing in the cloud and software team and the services and the digital transformation team. And I think we'll probably do more of these in the future, to some degree to what Nicki just said a couple minutes ago about sort of that question mark and the acceleration of adoption of a lot of these technologies that has gone from 5 years out to now, now truncated down to just months or even just a year. So I think if anything, we'll probably do more webinars that are focused on cross-industry and have these kinds of questions about what are your clients struggling with. So let's see the answers. Wow, look at that. So control and complexity of management by far, with security and accessibility second, and then lack of proven use cases. And that's great. I'm glad lack of proven use cases is on the board where it is, because it's something we're going to talk about quite a bit. Nicki, is anything about this poll surprise you at all?
Costs most definitely surprises me, just because budgets have been so constrained and cost is so top of mind and people have all of these juggling priorities. So that either tells me that people are thinking, well, we have to go with edge no matter what it costs because it's an imperative, or people are thinking, hey, we have a lot of other priorities going on, so we're not really going to consider costs around edge because we have other things to figure out, to kind of, while our hair is still metaphorically on fire, or as we're kind of hopefully leaving the pandemic.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess time to scale is another one of those that's kind of surprising, but I suppose everybody's time to scale has sort of gotten, as you said a few minutes ago, truncated. So we'll see how that plays out. And Nicki, if you want to continue here, and then we'll bring Boz into the discussion as well.
Okay, definitely. So on the left side of the screen, I promise you I will not go into every single one of these, the key trends driving edge computing. I intentionally put all of them up here just to give a visual sense as to how many trends there are. And if I had put little arrows connecting all of them, it would have been even more complex and would have probably burned your eyes. So with that, though, I wanted to take time just to speak to a couple that I think are especially key and that will feed into some of the themes that we'll be speaking about later, particularly when we get to the use cases. So starting with AI and machine learning, which I had referenced before, they're incredibly interesting, of course, just on their own, but when thinking about them in the context of edge, they are one of, if not the key enabling factor for intelligence at the edge. With the recent increase in access to and understanding of both AI and machine learning, demand and adoption at the edge has dramatically increased over the last year or so, and is really starting to allow people to see what is possible. And in some ways, as I was thinking about this earlier, the relationship between edge and AI and ML is kind of symbolic in that AI and machine learning require the extremely fast processing of data, which edge computing enables, and then in turn, AI and ML enable higher performance of compute resources and intelligence at the edge. And we'll definitely go a bit more into the tangible aspects of these when referencing a few use cases in a couple of minutes. And the other point I wanted to quickly reference is just the variety and increasing sophistication of the devices themselves, whether it's a robotic arm on a factory floor, a phone, or a sensor that's part of a healthcare monitoring system. They are increasing in power, in memory, in capability. Much of this is also fueled by machine learning and artificial intelligence, and are also becoming increasingly connected with one another. And all of this leads to one of the key questions of how do we make sense of all of this, all of this data, and how do we make sure that we are doing it the right way and that we're secure? And just how do we manage all of the complexity that is displayed on the left-hand side of the screen? So with that, I'll pass the mic over to Boz, who can review some of these complexities from the lens of the IT services team with a few key points before we delve what I believe is into the use cases.
Sure. Thank you, Nicki. Certainly, I mean, as we think about, not just Edge in a vacuum, look at Edge as its role as part of the broader digital transformation initiatives that many buyers are embarking on. The question around ROI often comes to mind. And we can see, from other technologies, the wave of adoption, the ebbs and flow of adoption. Cloud comes to mind as the most recent one. Is it a way like, okay, certainly COVID accelerated cloud adoption, but it's not always clear cut. So Edge certainly faces a similar fate in the sense of like, what does it do? How vendors are thinking about Edge as they are pitching their services to enterprise buyers that are overwhelmed with so many technologies and deciding which one they should invest in, where the use cases, how to think about the use cases. So certainly vendors from storage to cloud and services, they need to ensure that they can deliver on the promise and managing the integrated nature of the appliances that are required for digital transformation initiatives. Vendors that have those proven capabilities certainly are well positioned to drive some of those conversations. Edge compute, while it has been, more as Nicki points out, has been a hardware and cloud vendors play. We started increasingly seeing services providers had the opportunity to engage with clients as long as they position themselves as the orchestrators of value, which really that value stems from the reducing time to insight, especially as the pool of data continues to expand. At the same time, though, what we think about when we think about vendors and how they collaborate and interact with the ecosystem and think about the entire IT infrastructure stack, not all the data has to move quickly as maybe Edge allows. So Edge, in that case, will become more of the extension of cloud rather than just a threat to it, especially as more buyers prefer to separate those mission-critical applications from non-essential application data, which obviously raises the concerns around security and storage, which we saw that early in the post. Security is still up as a concern for preventing Edge adoption at scale. At the same time, Edge also provides an opportunity for vendors that are into really knee-deep in digital transformation to bridge the worlds of the maturing IoT and emerging 5G technologies. And again, improving connectivity and reducing latencies are driving some of those adoptions. But it boils down, again, proving the ROI, understanding where those systems are heading and how they interact with each other. The angle about scale, I think it's important that vendors that are really adopting and approaching Edge deployment with scale in mind are certainly a better position, because the driving proof of concept, proof of proof of value use cases, just for the sake of just driving kind of awareness, those may not be as easily scaled up if the plan is not to be approached with scale in mind from the first place. It's really about understanding where else Edge fits, how it fits, how are vendors interacting with each other, not just on the services, how do they interact with the storage, how is that with the cloud vendors, with IT, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of moving pieces. The value is there. The ROI, it might be a challenging part to prove into it, but it's certainly starting to see some use cases which we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides, where vendors are not just pitching, but actually executing certain areas and applications that Edge provides that immediate ROI that vendors are really trying to drive adoption around. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Nicki to start talking about the use cases.
Thank you, Boz. And really, this is at least my favorite part, and I think in many people would agree that use cases, bringing the technology to life and kind of seeing where all these discussions are actually become tangible is really interesting. Obviously, we only have 4 categories on here, and we're scratching the surface, to say the least. So we just picked 4 categories that we thought would be accessible, easy to talk about, and that gave slightly different angles on the various ways in which edge computing is working across different verticals. That being said, before I get into any of the specifics around retail and manufacturing and logistics, which are the 2 that I'll be speaking to, I think it's important to start with a point that in many cases, regardless of the vertical or industry, that what's enabling at the edge, like the AI, the ML, the concept of smart sensors and video analytics, can also be often applied quite universally. So for instance, looking at retail, if you're looking at retail inventory tracking in a store, there can be sensors placed, say, on shelves that can communicate that supply is running low, which can lead to a restocking alert and the shelf gets restocked. And then also over time, through machine learning, inform and advise on consumption patterns to help preempt low stock before it's too late. Pretty straightforward example. This type of sensor in retail could also work in tandem with a camera who monitors foot traffic. So real-time data advising that an item that we think, oh, that should be more popular but doesn't sell, well, maybe it should just be placed in a more high visibility area in the store floor. In the same vein, a similar sensor on a shelf in a manufacturing floor could notify of low stock and communicate with a robotic fulfillment arm, and could make note that the item may not be optimally placed on certain pallets for efficient routing. It could also be the same sort of sensor and the same sort of analytics as retail, but just in a very different environment. And these examples are somewhat close together, but of course get more extreme, especially when you start to talk about more ruggedized environments, out in the field, such as in oil and mining. But, the same mantra still holds true. It's not maybe exactly the same sensor. They do have to be reconfigured, but the idea is still the same regardless. Retail has another couple of interesting examples utilizing visual analytics. These ones can be kind of fun. So dressing room mirrors have started to be equipped with sensors and AR/VR technology that can interpret your image, provide suggestions as to what might go well with your current style, and recommend if the piece is in stock. So you can get that delivered to your actual dressing room without having to retrieve it yourself. If that item is out of stock and you decide that you would like to try it, it can mock up a fake image in the mirror of what you may look like, and if you approve, directly place an order for you in the warehouse. I personally have not experienced this yet, but could be interesting. Digital promotions are another aspect of this within retail. So sensors placed around stores that recommend to you in real time the types of items that you may gravitate towards, not only based on your style, so what the video is actually picking up, but where in the store are you spending the majority of your time. And then over time, if you have patterns over time, can start to kind of create a machine learning algorithm that's unique to you. So I see this as a very much in-person version of what the pop-up ads that come up, if you happen to be talking to someone, so you're going on a trip to go hiking, you're talking about hiking shoes, and now when you go on Facebook or even log into your email, all you can see on your phone for a couple of days is hiking shoe ads. So, if we've ever said, oh, isn't that creepy, your phone is listening to you and kind of laughed about it, but this is kind of like taking that concept to the next level, I guess, whether we like it or not. And then, finally, to shift back to manufacturing, predictive maintenance is another huge use case from both a safety as well as an efficiency standpoint. Consider the importance, for instance, if a sensor notices that a forklift isn't incorrectly balancing the right load ratios. The sensor can notify a central operating system to not only shut the machine down and notify the driver, but also make note of the issue in the context of the type of work that the machine was seeing. So this could have been potentially an ongoing issue if it wasn't corrected. And then from a safety standpoint, say a camera notices that an employee is in a hazardous area, or there's some other potentially dangerous obstruction present. An AI-enabled camera can shut down all of the machinery running in that area and create an alert for that employee. And these examples, especially when it comes to the manufacturing ones that I just reviewed, very much support the convergence of IT and OT, which should see a huge uptick in the next couple of years, especially as organizations start to prioritize not just taking the insight from new sources of data, but actually integrating that intelligence into processes and workflows using capabilities at the edge. So while all these capabilities can create great efficiencies and lead to huge returns on ROI, very few will be turnkey, and without a doubt will necessitate a degree of professional services and advice to actually optimize all of these technologies and make sure that they're being maximized. And with that, I will turn over to Patrick, who can probably expand on one of the most complex, use cases, that being smart cities for edge.
Yeah, thanks, Nicki. I mean, there's absolutely nothing turnkey about smart cities. So just a few thoughts on this. I'm going to come back to it again at the end of this presentation, but a few thoughts. Smart cities as a use case has been around for a long time. And from the perspectives of the IT services vendors and the consultancies, and obviously their municipal clients, This use case has faced a series of challenges. First, the technology was expensive and unreliable. That pretty much has been overcome and resolved. IoT sensors are cheaper and far more dependable than they were 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Second, connectivity was always a challenge because it was spotty at best. And when you think back to the days when you had to pay for Wi-Fi or you couldn't get a reliable signal, how many bars did you have, all that. A lot of that has been, for the most part, resolved, although we all still have Wi-Fi issues whenever we're outside of our own house or sometimes in it. But within a city, within a larger metropolitan context, the Wi-Fi is ubiquitous now. Increasingly, 5G is becoming ubiquitous. So that connectivity problem has, for the most part, been solved. So the IT services vendors and the consultancies that are working with city governments on these big smart city ideas now have cheaper, reliable, connected technology and even more advanced analytics that make the data that they're sucking in useful. But sucking in more data creates its own challenges, and that's where Edge steps in. So by helping the devices make the decisions at the edge in all the ways that Nicki just described, and that Boz is going to describe in a couple minutes, accelerating that time to action, decreasing the data flow. So smart city deployments, whether it's real simple like the streetlights or it's as complex as population tracking, that all becomes much easier to scale. And that part, scale, has always been the ultimate challenge in making smart cities viable, making the smart cities use case something really useful and something that IT services vendors and consultancies could actually deliver on. It had to go to scale, and that's where the benefit of Edge finally sort of complements and enables all of the other emerging technologies that have come around and evolved over the last few years with respect to smart cities. So again, I'll come back to some of these ideas a little bit later, but now I want to turn to Boz for some thoughts on the media and entertainment part. Boz?
Sure. I think that the media entertainment is somewhat, a category on its own, in a way of like thinking about where are the, not just the applications that we have outlined here, the enhanced stadiums experience, immersive gaming, preemptive maintenance, and so forth. I think this is where the true opportunity comes from Edge enabling is connecting and making those applications into the world of marketing and advertising. This is where we believe is going to come the true value of at scale from Edge as we think about what Edge and along with 5G and cloud and blockchain and so forth are increasingly becoming that connective tissue for new marketing services frameworks within the digital world, so to speak, which essentially sets the stage for a lot of vendors that have those strong creative and branding and advertising capabilities should be, another channel to drive more of an enterprise-wide transformation discussions. What the pandemic has done, what we have seen over the last year or so, continue to shape and read the direction of buyers' investments, with those marketing and advertising spend largely being folded within the IT budgets. So certainly that was happening prior to the pandemic, but that now it has increased even further. At the same time, a lot of customer experience is maturing as a market. Everybody wants to create like a customer experience-oriented applications, both front and back end, and internally for employee experience. Vendors are beginning to expand their portfolio that can support those front, middle, and back office functions. So what we think that's going to create is going to create such a springboard towards larger digital transformation initiatives as buyers are placing bets on modernizing those mission-critical applications to create brand awareness and trust among customer and employees. So it's kind of a push and pull relationship, so to speak, that while there are certain applications, as we have again highlighted here, but there's a bigger connecting tissue that can go into those larger digital transformation projects. Further, adoption of those technology-enabled content development and omnichannel platforms will certainly continue to benefit vendors that can provide the ongoing design and refinement support, but only if they can certainly master that hybrid engagement model. So while the technology is there and everyone kind of is trying to elevate the value, it's all how you engage with the customer. So the hybrid engagement model is, certainly something that many are still struggling to iron out, but they're getting better. We all got them, adjusted over the last 12 months. We've seen an increased adoption of technologies like AR and VR and even mixed reality MR, which are as a kind of enabling those interactions. Where we see the value of edge, where we think about how vendors are interacting with their clients is really about providing that connectivity again for those reality quote unquote technologies that can accelerate the applications to edge. Some of those vendors are testing those type of technologies within their own operations, how they interact internally. So that could kind of create a new use case. So bring it back to media and entertainment. The industry as a whole, it has so many applications. Certainly, it's about understanding, how you interact with the customer. But I think there's the notion, understanding, and proven capabilities within the marketing and advertising realm that can actually be elevated through the lens of edge, that can actually amplify those applications even further and make edge even more applicable as we think about the plethora of other emerging technologies like those AR, VR, and MR technologies that can be used along the way. So that's kind of like on the media entertainment. I'll turn it back over to Nicki to dive deeper into more on the COVID-specific use cases.
Thank you, Boz. And kind of as a blanketed statement, a lot of what we just covered do have COVID-specific angles. I mean, you saw with regards to, the smart city, social distancing was one. We wouldn't have had that on the chart, 18 months ago. So that kind of pervades throughout. But, we did want to, have a slide dedicated specifically to the topic, which is top of mind affecting everyone, which is large-scale vaccine distribution at the edge. Because what is being able to be accomplished at the edge, empowered by associated technologies, like AI, and then also bringing in blockchain and IoT is pretty critical to ensuring that these mission-critical healthcare needs are being met globally. So there are a couple of examples that I wanted to highlight, and then, Boz and Patrick, please chime in if you have anything to add. So the first example centers around the need to regulate vaccine temperatures, just to ensure that the shot is still viable. We all have heard about those crazy low temperatures that the shots need to be kept at, and if it goes above that, then it doesn't work, and it's essentially wasted. So to do so, there's an Israeli-based AI and IoT startup called Utilligent. They were one of the first to develop a IoT-based technology that enables organizations in the COVID-19 vaccine distribution chain just to make sure that the vaccine stayed at a certain temperature, and with sensors who could trigger an alert if, say, it was getting dangerously close to a point where, there needs to be cause for concern. Another example involved a collaboration between Atos with a Danish automatic storage company, Upri. This is quite similar to the example that I just outlined before. Sensors making sure that the temperature, remains stable and doesn't dip beyond dangerous levels. And they kind of took this a step further and also monitored elements such as humidity, carbon dioxide, and then processed the results to create an alert of any kind of disruption in the supply chain, and then fed this into larger ML algorithms for future deployments. And the third example is one that takes a slightly different angle, as it also pertains to people's own private health data, I should say. IBM blockchain technology and Salesforce Work.com have worked together, and then they're enabling businesses, schools, government agencies, you name it, to verify the vaccination status and other health information of individuals. And then what this has done is applied to IBM's digital health passport in an encrypted digital wallet on any individual's smartphone. So to share this medical information with an organization that's encrypted. And this is probably the most tenuous and complex of the examples, as it relates to the sensitivity of healthcare data. Also ties into the ongoing dialogue around data privacy, the communication of private data, and while some people really herald this as something really great to have, other people are still saying we're not ready for this, and it's been a solution that's been somewhat controversial, but I think has met some success in the marketplace. So we'll probably hear more of that as time goes on, and all of these, it's important to note, are also functioning as prototypes, real-time prototypes for future deployments of vaccines going forward. So, not just, COVID, the types of technologies being developed here that are being tested and using COVID as the testing ground will have great impact on how we distribute medicine in this case in the future. So with that, Patrick or Boz, did you guys have any additional insights, COVID or not, that relate to what I just went over?
No, I think I'm good. In the interest of time, maybe let's, Boz, unless you got something urgent, maybe we'll skip to the next polling question.
Yeah, let's move on.
Okay. So here we go. Second polling and the last polling question for today. So when you think about Edge, which vendor comes to mind as leading in developing new services and solutions? IBM, Atos, Accenture, Dell, Deloitte, HPE, AWS, Microsoft, or somebody we didn't put on this list. And as you're making your choice, just want to make sure everyone knows that we cover all these companies. We do quarterly reports on almost all of them, looking at their performance, looking at their strategy. We release those reports, an initial look at them right after they release their earnings, and then a couple weeks later, a more full report on everything that's going on, with, of course, the one exception on there being Deloitte, because they don't release earnings. So let's see what the results are. Boz and Nicki, I don't know if we want to take bets before we get this, but let's. And others, not surprisingly, tops the list. Deloitte, unfortunately, not getting a single vote, but kind of a mixed bag everywhere else. Microsoft doing really well. I'm personally surprised IBM isn't higher. That, I guess, betrays my own bias in the research that I've done and looking at Edge and looking at what IBM's been doing. Maybe it reflects IBM splitting in two and people not sure which company we were talking about. Nicki, any thoughts on the results here?
Yeah, I'm right there with you with IBM. I mean, again, maybe I'm also personally biased. I think they're doing pretty amazing things. I'm actually speaking about IBM in the next few minutes after this polling question. Atos is another one that I think the results are pretty good there. They're not as widely well known in the market as others, so it's kind of good that they're getting some recognition. And Microsoft versus AWS, I'm kind of wondering about why one versus another, since they always seem to kind of keep in parallel with one another. Like one does one thing in this area and the other one does kind of matches, and they kind of keep, on par. So I'd be interested to do a little digging into what might be different with Microsoft versus AWS. And of course, I'm definitely fascinated to hear the list of others.
Well, and then Boz, looking at Accenture and Deloitte, two companies that you cover, not getting a single vote. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually what this tells me is that, to my point earlier that we made about digital transformation being a complex, discussions and new models, new architecture, it sounds to me it's a lot about, based on the vendors list, that those vendors have hardware in their stack. They also have software in their stack. And Accenture and Deloitte are very much pure services play, right? So I think that's to me is the takeaway here, is that you need to also understand the technology for the technology's sake when it comes to Edge. And maybe there's still a broader opportunity to develop a better, deeper, more integrated use cases. And that's where I think Deloitte and Accenture could play well, but maybe Edge is, based on the responses, right now requires a little bit more holistic approach and a holistic portfolio than just the services angle. That's what it tells me, this poll.
Yeah, that's, I would definitely agree. Go ahead, Nicki.
I would also say, just with regard to the two hyperscalers on here, just by virtue of the fact that their innovation engines are so strong and they're so close to the development of some of these solutions, and their partnership networks are so close in co-development, that it's kind of a natural fit to automatically think that they'd be leading the development here in adjacent to all that they're doing in hybrid and AI, ML, et cetera.
So I think what else this tells me is that the next time we do a webinar on Edge, we're going to put up a nice bubble chart of who's had the best growth and the most success lately, and then see where it goes from there. So, all right, let's continue now. Back to Nicki, I think, to talk about IBM specifically, right?
Yep, exactly. So as I said, to the point of IBM, so we wanted to speak for a little bit around ecosystems and partnerships. So, moving on to how the various vendors with their complex portfolios and services, and, people have to figure out who to work with who. This is getting to be a completely complex question, since you've got device manufacturers, you have developers, hardware manufacturers, and then the companies like we're just on the screen. You have the IBMs, Amazons, Microsoft. None of them in isolation are, even if some may think they are, but I think kind of beyond that point, are in a position to dictate solely how this is going to be done, how it's going to play out or evolve. And so ecosystems have become kind of not just partnerships, but ecosystems have become something that we've increasingly seen flourish, and particularly with regards to Edge. So with that, I emphasize IBM here because it's one of the companies that I've come to reference quite frequently due to the fact that their strategy really exemplifies the concept of ecosystems, collaborative standards of development and compliance, and all of this really centers around their history of open standards and projects that are largely formed through the Linux Foundation. Last year, after more than 4 years spent building an edge device management platform, IBM immediately open sourced it and contributed it within Linux Foundation to create an open framework for edge computing. So the horizon on the screen, that image, is because this is called Open Horizon. This technology is really the backbone of IBM's proprietary Edge Application Manager. And IBM execs actually have explained that it was really conceived as open source right from the start. The notion of open source is further embraced by IBM's recent build out of an edge ecosystem, and it's this holistic approach versus locking participants into a specific backend or a specific model that really, I guess, embraces the idea of collaboration, open development, and has attracted a lot of different companies to join that ecosystem within a quite a short period of time. So to kind of make this a little bit more tangible, so what you see on the screen is obviously IBM and some of their key focuses, and then two of the customers that are edge players that I've featured in our latest edge market landscape, and two that I have come to know quite well, who are part of this IBM ecosystem with their own distinct way of offering unique value as part of the IBM ecosystem and partnering directly with IBM. I'll start with Clearblade. Clearblade is one of the vendors in the edge space that we feature because they bring a very well-defined software capability with asset tracking, and that directly targets a pocket of need to promote asset efficiencies and prevent asset theft. It's very straightforward. It's designed to interact with other software seamlessly, and it's infrastructure agnostic, so immediately it becomes a valuable partner in the enterprise edge compute market when you think back again to all the tangles of connection points between IoT devices, protocols, gateways, the cloud, or what some of the execs at Clearblade have often referred to as the IoT rat's nest, which I kind of like, because it seems fairly apt description. So the partnership here then with Clearblade can be best introduced as the integration of IBM's Edge Application Manager with the Clearblade Edge Asset Monitor, which is the automated deployment of edge applications. And I'm not going to get into the technical details. I'd probably get lost in 5 minutes. But essentially, the customer at the end of the day gets the best of both worlds with the prevention of asset theft with Clearblade and the overarching management of all their gateways or devices with IBM. And now Mimic is another example who has emerged as a really exciting, game-changing edge player and is literally reimagining a brand new architecture and interaction of systems independently from traditional cloud and edge systems. So Mimic has what they call a hybrid edge cloud solution that gives Mimic the ability to convert cloud applications from a fixed client server model to a fully distributed architecture. And what this does is allow devices to act as servers across a variety of verticals. And what this does is also very much play into the hyper-connected reality that devices are increasingly interacting as personal endpoints in literally every aspect of our life, regardless of vertical, and are also starting to act more independently of the cloud. So what the partnership here enables is the application of the capabilities of IBM's Edge Application Manager and AI infrastructure helps manage these local clusters that Mimic's hybrid cloud platform enables. Creates a management layer over what Mimic is deploying at the edge with little to no connection to the actual cloud. And the end result here is natural scalability and speed that's saving costs and is open and accessible while still remaining secure. And I know those all sound kind of like marketing buzzwords, but those are really, if you bullet them out and see what this is enabling Mimic and IBM's customers to do, this is what they are all citing as the top game changers. So with that, I think this is a good entryway to kind of go into what Boz will cover, which is a more specific example as to how another player, Atos, who's in our polling question, is managing its very own cloud edge portfolio.
So before Boz jumps in, I want to say one thing real quick. So we did get a question in the Q&A, someone asking for a few examples of what the other folks on the line, the other attendees, consider to be the others in that list of all the leading edge vendors that we had before that we talked about for a while. So we don't have, this platform doesn't support everybody just sort of jumping in and throwing that up there. But if you are interested, you could throw your answers to that question into the Q&A box, and at the end we'll read some of those out loud. So if you have some thoughts on who the others are that were on your mind, and you'd like to go ahead and put that answer in the Q&A box. So with that, hand it back to Boz.
Sure. Thank you, Patrick. So to just move on to the next slide. Perfect. So real quick here, I mean, we kind of talked about it a couple of times already throughout the presentation, but on the left side, what the visual represents is really about the value of services vendors. And, you know, Patrick and I come from the services group within TBR and certainly track many of those vendors quite closely and understanding and seeing where and how those vendors play and what's their role when it comes to Edge and any other emerging technologies. But the services vendors that can really successfully design and integrate and manage data assets in a hybrid IT setting appear to be really the invaluable channel partners, but only if they're able to mitigate the risk, the security risk, and innovate at the edge to provide faster time to insight. That's kind of like the setting the table stakes right now. And when it comes to speed, you know, it's certainly a key benefit for Edge. It's something that, you know, vendors tout often. It's kind of like the core benefit. But we see, you know, quantum, you know, or at least Edge becoming the platform for accelerating quantum adoption. That's a topic for another webinar. We have, you know, the quantum research going on as well. But it's important to understand how those services vendors are doing the management expertise, the implementation, and the enhancement. So those kind of like, you know, how the, you know, technology for technology's sake these days is really becoming commodity. And, you know, it cannot just be, you need to talk about the business value. And one vendor we want to amplify here and to talk a little bit more about is Atos. As we saw earlier, Atos kind of ranked up the top 3, I believe, if I go back to the poll or the number 4 of the listing in terms of like a leading vendor within Edge. And what we see from Atos and how Atos actually stacks up is really that holistic portfolio that the company manages when it comes to the full managed cloud Edge. It's the entire stack that we have outlined here from cloud Edge through data platform and field services, with each one of them kind of interconnected and playing its role. In the core, I mean, the Atos is, you know, while it's a systems integrator, it does have a significant hardware stack when it comes to the boosted Quanta Edge platform. That's really that bottom layer of that cloud edge device hardware that Atos brings into bear and understanding to know that you know that can play in the specific use cases and applications. Then it goes up on the application platform with Kubernetes-based application platform that's with deployment and lifecycle management that's cascading into cloud. Then the data platform is kind of the next layer, which allows for data streaming and transforming at the edge. And, you know, it's really about for interference in the long-term storage in cloud. And then another layer above that, that DevSecOps capabilities that many other vendors also have, but it's certainly it's connected to the rest of the stack that the Atos portfolio has, is the implementation and automation of secure and compliant and continuous IoT and OT and ML kind of systems. And then the support part, which is going back to the services, both Service Desk, which is a cloud contact centers with AI capabilities and other voice-enabled, machine learning capabilities as well as the field services support. So when it's not, when there's no opportunity for online support, there's actually an on-site support from Atos field services desk. So it's that stack. It's something that we want to kind of highlight here that while some of the vendors have some of those capabilities, and they're playing within specific horizontal. Atos kind of like among the services vendors it's a good example, provides really a strong use case of how vendors are trying to go to market and they can capitalize on the technology needs this end-to-end technologies today. It's about understanding, simplification, speed, and low cost, to enable those cloud-enabled digital transformation initiatives that are, enabled through the Atos' full cloud managed edge portfolio. So it's about one vendor example, but it's a vendor that, again, it brings up all these capabilities under one platform, and it's about integration with the rest. And again, to the point earlier we made about Edge not being a threat to cloud, but an extension, I think Atos makes that use case with their portfolio stack, and they're trying to build even further their industry-specific capabilities from the, they pivoted about a year or so ago from a kind of like a horizontal play, a little bit more into the industry-oriented P&L, and that's helping them also drive a little bit more of that front end of the final discussions and building that management expertise, but that's highly backed up by what they have in the background from a technology and software capability. So just want to spotlight Atos for a moment here before I turn it over to Patrick, that he'll go a little bit deeper into one of his favorite use cases on smart cities and specifically on ports. Patrick?
Thanks, Boz. And I'm glad we highlighted Atos after having seen them do so well in the polling question. So Maritime ports, and this we're going to wrap up with this, and then we'll handle some of the questions that have come in. Maritime ports is one of my favorite use cases for pretty much all emerging technologies for a few pretty simple reasons. First, every emerging technology has a very distinct role to play. IoT sensors on the ships and in the channels and on the trucks, analytics determine the most efficient process and the operations, analytics for predictive maintenance. Blockchain infuses trust, that's what it does anyway, but into the larger ecosystem and can expedite customs and other trade processes within a port. And even AR, VR, if you want to get into training tugboat pilots without burning extra fuel. And there's a question in the Q&A about AR, VR and what is preventing increased adoption of it. And Nicki and Boz can weigh in on this when we finish here. But for me, the biggest thing is the reluctance to change. It's all about the change management. It's not about the technology. If anything, Edge is helping AR, VR become a better use case and a more useful technology. But until you get the people to agree, you're not going to get that fast adoption. Let's not go down that road. So all those other technologies, and then of course Edge within a maritime port makes faster decisions. It allows you to make faster decisions. It enables autonomous trucking. It enables you to get the most from IoT devices, and then, as you've heard me say before, it enables scale. The second reason that I think maritime ports are such an important use case are they're both a contained ecosystem. They have a clear governing authority, and they have cooperation among partners and competitors within the ecosystem. And that's essential because they all have that shared sort of expectations and outcomes. Everyone wants ships to load and unload as fast as possible and safely and with the right goods going to the right people. So it's contained in that sense, but this is a really important, it's not a contained ecosystem because of the various actors with significant interest in port operations who are not in the daily ecosystem or even physically in the port. So think about governments, having an interest in taxes and safety and the traceability of goods. Think about fire and rescue who are not physically located in the port. They might be part of the city, but need access to the port in the case of an emergency. And of course, then there's all the sort of the next mile and the last mile transportation links, people who are taking those goods beyond the port. So all of these actors depend on ports to operate well. And this is where the opportunities continue to grow for the IT services vendors and the consultancies, because as Boz called them before, the orchestrators of value, they provide the linkages through technologies and through their role as trusted advisors. So ports they're a playground for emerging technology. They're a massively complex ecosystem, which leads to the third reason why I like using ports as a use case. And it gets back to what I said earlier about smart cities. Ports can serve as that test bed for all these technologies, for the processes, for the change management, back to the AR/VR problem, and the challenges that cities face when they want to move towards smart cities, towards smart operations. So for the IT services vendors and the consultancies that we look at all the time and we work with, making sure they can articulate the value of Edge and the opportunities that Edge enables in this semi-confined ecosystem then allows them to take that value and that opportunity and scale it to a citywide environment. So I think we're going to see use cases like Port of Rotterdam, Dubai Ports, or Dubai Ports World, those jump out, increasingly deployed as blueprints for accelerated smart city adoption. And I know, I'm fully aware, it's my soapbox. I'm extremely optimistic on this. It's an optimistic perspective. And that it's optimistic, particularly given all the challenges. And those are mostly, and challenges within smart cities, and those are mostly around, again, change management, around the ethical, challenges of facial recognition, and even the social distancing thing that Nicki mentioned earlier. And of course, the budgetary constraints around spending on technology like Edge or like blockchain or like IoT. All of that still remains for all these smart cities, but I'm going to stay optimistic for now. So with that, we're going ahead and tackle some questions. I do want to say we got in a couple of notes from people responding to who are the others. One listed was NTT, and another was, I want to say it's Rafay, R-A-F-A-Y. Nicki, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, I know we're all familiar with NTT. Nicki, does Rafay jump out? You do know them, okay.
I know that's a new one, but I will make note of it. We're always looking for new players to cover in that space, so interesting.
Excellent. So we'll tackle a couple of questions here. We have a little bit of time left. First one is 5G or Edge. Which one, 5G or Edge, do you think will scale first in terms of adoption? Nicki, you want to take the first crack at that?
Yeah, this one's an interesting one, and I kind of wish we had our telco lead on the phone because he might have a different take on it. But I think it very much, not one's going to scale before the other. It's like they both kind of rely on one another. 5G can exist without Edge, but Edge gives 5G so many interesting deployments to apply its technology to. It's has given it a platform to really explode and to become relevant, and especially because there has been so much hype leading up that without Edge, I could see 5G, even if it helped us as individuals, maybe our networks a lot faster, would make, the whole use case behind 5G kind of fall a bit more flat. And then, on the flip side, the core benefit, the core to Edge is latency, low latency. So we always talk about use cases that require low latency. Especially when it's super mission critical, in self-driving cars, in healthcare, detecting a heart attack, and that you have to immediately let a healthcare person know. Edge has been waiting on 5G for a while to really take the use cases to the next level. So by injecting 5G into Edge, it actually gives it the teeth that we've always been saying that it has, but to a degree much higher than it ever had before. So I don't know if that. I hope that's not a cop-out answer, but they really do kind of need each other. And also, just as a side note, there's been a lot of partnerships between the hyperscalers and the large telcos like Verizon and AT&T are some of the obvious ones, but also some ones in Europe. And Edge is a core reason why they're partnering together. That kind of it's to the kind of what I was saying. They don't see their solutions really being able to thrive and gain traction in the market in isolation. That by working together, they're able to create a value, create a product, create something together that they just couldn't do without partnering together.
Yeah, that's great. That's great, Nicki. And I don't think it's a cop-out answer because all of these technologies all depend on each other in so many ways. So we got another vote for one of the others, and that's Capgemini Engineering, which I think is fascinating because we tend to look at Capgemini and Atos as sort of sister companies, or at least they're very similar. On the surface, both being European-based, both being global IT services vendors. But in so many ways, they're so different. And Capgemini has a very different DNA and a very different kind of, a different sort of origin story, if you will, than Atos. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that continues to play out, as I think they've actually become more and more like each other over the last few years. So the next question, Boz, this one is definitely for you. How has COVID-19 changed buyers' spend on emerging technologies, including Edge? Boz, you want to tackle that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very well-timed question, actually, because we are just in the midst of our Voice of the Customer research for our June iteration, summer iterations. It's going to be May, and the May report. But what we saw and what we heard in December and last summer, and we're hearing right now, is that while after the initial pause in the end of 1Q and 2Q last year, the demand is certainly had pent up. The spend is certainly there, and it's really about cloud is taking a significant portion of it, no surprise. But there's two kind of schools of thought around cloud. One is about which applications, and can I save some of my applications to be more cost efficient, and the other one is really cloud as an enabler of a bigger transformation, and really about looking at those buyers that are not seeing cloud just to save money but to drive value. And that's where I think this is the portion of buyers that are also appreciating the opportunity that Edge provides and the other emerging technologies and so forth. Cloud leads the stack in terms of spend from a primary technology, but IoT and Edge and analytics are certainly quickly catching up, because what COVID kind of forced a lot of the buyers is that some of those that were leap in the back, kind of like laggards, they are trying to leapfrog, investing in cloud primarily, but the ones that are leading the stack in terms of digital transformation are trying to really advance themselves and taking advantage of other technologies beyond just cloud and be a little bit more business transformation and business process optimization, not just cost efficiency. So the spend is there. Certainly spent in IT consulting, spend in managed services. Those are the two big areas that we have seen an uptick and really opportunities for vendors to pursue, and we see a lot of investments on the vendor side as well, not just traditional IT services, but management consultancies and technology vendors that are investing either human-enabled, human-delivered managed services, but also automation-enabled managed services.
And I want to put in a plug for blockchain, because we're publishing a digital transformation blockchain market landscape either this week or next week. I've lost track of the pause.
On Friday.
I know that on Friday. Okay, beautiful, on Friday. So I know that spend around blockchain has certainly sort of, in my mind, hit a low probably in 2020. It certainly fell off the map for a lot of enterprises. I think it's going to come roaring back. That's my own personal opinion. So we haven't seen that yet, but looking at all the different signs that we see, I think it's out there. We did get another question, and I want to make sure we get to. And the question is, have you studied the edge market in terms of size and segments, very small to large? Nick, you want to talk about the edge market landscape and what exactly it covers?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Patrick. And I always welcome the opportunity for a quick plug. So for the last year and a half or so, TBR has been covering Edge actively, in that we have we have our own report that's dedicated to the enterprise Edge. We also have a adjacent telco Edge report, which is specifically telco focused. In the enterprise Edge report, which I author, it's focused on general trends in the industry. We profile some of the key players, and some of the obvious ones don't change, and we talk about all the various scenarios in much greater detail than we were able to do today with use cases, as we do extensively interview the vendors that we do feature, and get some great sound bites and insights from them. And each one kind of has its own theme. So the last time I focused on, I was calling them niche. I kind of got a little pushback. Maybe it's more emerging if someone didn't feel like they were niche. But we really focused on some of the smaller players. In some cases, some of the smaller players who are gearing up perhaps to be acquired. And then some of the smaller players, like the ones I spoke about today, being Mimic and Clearblade, and how they were becoming integral parts of much larger ecosystems. And even though they're 30-person or so companies, they're doing things that no one else is doing, and they are filling in gaps that the IBMs and AWSs of the world either don't have time or haven't thought about to enhance their overall value proposition. So that was the theme in the last one. And after prepping for this webinar and thinking through it, I think the next one will actually take on a much more heavy IT services angle. So kind of integrating some of the points that we spoke about today, and delving much more into how this piece of the market has evolved. So this report is pretty cool, because I'm kind of given carte blanche as to kind of make it what I want to, based on what I think is the most interesting thing that we're seeing at any given period of time. So that publishes twice a year. Next time will be in August. Okay, end of plug.
Excellent. Thanks, Nicki. And end of the webinar. And thank you all for attending. If you want the the PowerPoint deck, please just shoot us a note. Our emails are right up there on the screen. You will be getting an email to take a survey and give you a chance to sign up for the next webinars. Thank you all very much for attending, and take care. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.